first, Rabbi?
Okay, you all need to say yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so good evening, shalom, Shabbat shalom. Some of you I saw this morning in Shacharit at the river, which was very nice. And what we're doing now is Melave Malka. Melave Malka is, going with the queen. So we welcome the queen in with Kabbalat Shabbat on Friday night, and we don't actually want Shabbat to go, so we're with her in these late afternoon hours. And only when I moved to Edmonton, I understood what Melave Malka is about, because the evening never ends here in the summer. So you need to bring in something new to do something with Shabbat afternoon. So it all makes sense now. And for our Melave Malka, today Jack is going to talk with us. And I'll talk a bit, but mostly Jack, because he knows more about this than I do, about this book, Catch 67, by Micah Goodman, who is an Israeli philosopher, I think you would call him. Jack
Yes.
will probably give more information about this. And so I think a Melave Malka with the book club is a great idea. We can look at different books. Doesn't always have to be political. But this is something really nice to do in the afternoon of Shabbat. So thank you, Jack, for offering to teach and work on this book. And so now I'll mute myself and it's over to you.
Okay, thank you.
3, 4, 5.
Okay,
6,
you all see my
7, 12.
outline. Sorry? I thought I heard something. You all see my outline. You know the title of the book, Catch 67, which refers to the 1967 Six-Day War, right? Where Israel ended up very victorious and ended up with an awful lot more territory than it started. And that's what created the catch that Micah Goodman put into the title of his book. That essentially, nobody knows what to do. No matter what you do, there's going to be a problem. If you withdraw, there's a problem. If you stay, there's a problem. That's what the Catch 67 is essentially. Now, I'm going to be doing a summary of the book, except for one part that Gil is taking over, having to do with being pragmatic, which was one of the important purposes of Micah Goodman. He's really trying to convince the Israelis that it's very important that they not make this issue of withdrawal versus building a lot more settlements, to not make it part of their identity, to detach a little bit and approach it more pragmatically and with more respect for one another, okay? Now, I'm also going to, in addition to that, I'm going to be very brief in summarizing the book because it summarizes very easily. There's a lot of detail, an awful lot of detail, and an awful lot of footnotes, which are really worth pursuing. But the gist of it comes across very quickly, I think, very easily. I'm also going to deal with a critique of the book by Ehud Barak, who, as you all know, was Prime Minister of Israel between 1999 and 2001. And very importantly, was involved in a very serious attempt to strike a peace agreement with Arafat, with the Palestinians at Camp David, under the guidance of the then President of the United States. And it failed colossally, but he did try, and he's also, was the leader of the army and defense minister as well, so he knows a fair amount of security and defense, so he's certainly entitled to write a critique about this book, and he does. So I'll talk about that a bit at the end. Then I've also listed up here a response from Micah Goodman to Ehud Barak's critique, which I'm not going to go into. If any of you are interested, you see the reference there, arose, the 13th of May, 2017. Sorry, the 19th of May, 2017, very worth looking at. Finally, Barak and his critique essentially takes the position that Micah Goodman, is really outside of his area of expertise when he's talking about military strategy, security, and so on and so forth. And Barak makes reference to some plans that have been drawn up in the not too recent past to try to suggest how security can be provided to Israel, even if it does withdraw from most of the West Bank. So I think that's relevant here as well. I'm not going to talk about the details, but some of that will come out in looking at Barak's critique. Okay, first of all, I want to deal with Goodman's purpose in writing the book, or purposes in writing the book. Primarily, and this is where Gila is going to come in towards the end, primarily he says he wrote the book because he hoped to heal the poisoned debate between the Israeli left and right. Very simple. And the debate, of course, is whether to do what the right wants, especially the religious right, to build settlements ad infinitum, or to do what the left wants, to withdraw at the very least from most of the West Bank, while still maintaining security. Now, Goodman, to try to reduce the poison debate, urges Israelis to be pragmatic in their approach to the conflict and how they carry on the debate. And you'll hear more about that. Also, Micah Goodman says that it's essential that those involved in the debate listen to each other respectfully. And in the book, Micah Goodman models this beautifully, how to be respectful of very opposite positions. In fact, the title Catch 67 conveys to us, or conveys to me after I've read the book, that Goodman is coming down on the side of the right has got it right, and so has the left got it right. The right is right that if, the right is correct that if Israel pulls out of the West Bank, there'll be a dire danger to Israel's security, and says that the left is also totally correct that if Israel doesn't pull out of the West Bank, or most of the West Bank, then Israel is facing a demographic tsunami, which means essentially that at some point, the argument will be when, but at some point, given the rate of increase of the Palestinians versus the Israelis, at some point there are going to be more Palestinians between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. At which point, if nothing changes, if Israel is still occupying all of the West Bank, then I suppose you could consider Israel to legitimately be an apartheid state because you'll have a minority ruling over a majority. The opposite, of course, is if Israel decides to extend the vote to all Palestinians, then the Israelis, the Jews, would be a minority, and the Palestinians would call the shots, which presumably would create an awful danger as well. So Micah Goodman is arguing the right has a very, very strong point in not wanting to withdraw helter-skelter because of the security risk, and the left is correct as well, there is a demographic threat. And I should point out to you that Goodman, he's very balanced in how he approaches the topic. For example, on the question of whether there is or isn't a demographic threat, the left says there is. The right says maybe not, or certainly not. I think Goodman has investigated the sources, or investigated both positions, taking a look at some of the sources of the information, and he himself has concluded that the left is correct on this point. There is a demographic threat. More on this later. A final purpose, or another purpose rather, say a second purpose that that Goodman intended in writing this book is to essentially to explain the ideology and political arguments of the left and right. And this is important because the debate is driven by ideology and political arguments, not entirely, but very largely it's a matter of ideology and political arguments. Finally, Goodman, through the book, wants to explain why a final settlement with the Palestinians is pretty well impossible for the foreseeable future. He's very clear about this, and we'll look at the reasons that he gives. He says, in view of that, and in view that it's impossible to really think in terms of a complete peace agreement in the foreseeable future, and in view of the fact that there is a demographic threat, according to Goodman, it's very important that Israel begin to shrink the occupation. And that's part of what I'm going to be talking about. In talking about shrinking the occupation, Goodman means essentially that Israel try to implement two plans, or one of two plans, or some mixture of two plans, one of which is called a partial peace plan, and the other is called a divergence plan, at this very time, really to get onto it, but it's going to take some time to do, of course. Now, an important characteristic of each of these, the partial peace plan, the divergence plan, is neither of them require the Palestinians to declare that the conflict is over. Neither of them require the Palestinians to sign a peace treaty. Neither of them require the Palestinians to give up their claims for return of refugees. None of them require Palestinians to give up the land in the West Bank that Israel is going to continue to stay on. So this is something Israel can do. Either of these is something Israel can do unilaterally, better with cooperation, but can be done unilaterally. The advantage of implementing these two plans, either or some combination thereof, is that Israel will then be more separate from the Palestinians in the West Bank, thereby reducing that demographic threat, because there will be two distinct areas. And we'll see when I talk about the two plans how this will work out according to him. Okay, how well has Goodman succeeded in meeting the purposes of the book? First of all, he himself acknowledges at the very beginning of the book that his book was exceptionally popular in Israel. Many, many readers, many important readers, many reviews written in Hebrew. But unlike what he hoped would happen, that the people debating, the left and right debating this issue, instead of becoming more agreeable and more respectful, the opposite happened. He's determined that in the reviews of his book, there are people who insult him by calling him a left-winger, and there are other people who insult him by calling him a right-winger. In other words, he didn't manage through the book and through people reading it and people reviewing it and writing about it and talking about it to bring about a less poisoned debate. So he failed in that particular objective. Is there something worthwhile to hope for with respect to that objective? Perhaps, because the book was translated into English was written in 2017, translated into English in 2018, and I would suspect that amongst American Jews sympathetic to Israel, it may have a far more beneficial effect than it does in Israel. That's what I suspect, but that remains to be seen. In terms of explaining the ideology and the arguments behind the dispute, I think he succeeds admirably. And in terms of explaining why settlement with the Palestinians is not possible in the foreseeable future, Ehud Barak takes strong issue with his position on that. Remember, Goodman says it's not possible. Ehud Barak is going to say it can be done, and it must be done. And it must be done using instrumentalities that are far more bold and daring than the partial peace plan or the divergence plan. Okay, the next topic is, let's take a look very briefly at the ideology of the Israeli left and the right that drives this dispute that's been irresolvable. I think that you can simply say that the ideology of the right can be characterized as follows. If you, as an Israeli, assert that the Jews have a right to annex and settle all or most of the West Bank, using slogans such as "God gave us this land, it is ours," or something not religious, but it is our ancestral homeland, and this gives us the right to settle, gives us greater rights than Palestinians, then that is right-wing ideology, plain and simple. It doesn't really mean at this time much more than that when you see somebody's right, other than that's the position they take on the West Bank. On the left, you're of the left in Israel, if you value the human rights of the Palestinians, if you give that a fair amount of weight, and you advocate, at the very least, large withdrawals from the West Bank consistent with maintaining Israel's security. So is that difference very clear? Okay. Now, I want you to just note briefly that the words right and left have very different meaning in Israel at this time than they do in North America. It's largely confined to your position on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and that's it. The next topic that I want to deal with briefly is how the definitions of right and left in Israel have changed over the last 50, 60 years, which is an interesting topic in itself. Now, I found it hard to believe, this is part of the useful information I got from this particular book, that originally the Israeli right, for example, under Menachem Begin, was extremely strong on valuing human rights, which really surprised me. And Begin's predecessor, his mentor, Tzvi Jabotinsky, was very strong on valuing human rights, and Jabotinsky in advocating for a Jewish state in Palestine, he absolutely insisted that the rights of the Palestinians would have to be fully and completely respected. So that was the right at the time. But this has shifted very, very considerably because as a result of the victory in the Six-Day War and the religious right coming strongly to the fore with their messianic ideas, that the victory of the Six-Day War was a first step, a first visible step in the coming of the Messiah, and that the Messiah's advent could not be stopped, that it was an absolute sin to stop it. Therefore, Jews had to settle the territory of the West Bank, and that would hasten the arrival of the Messiah. In any event, since the right in Israel has become dominated by the religious Zionist right, there's no longer this treasuring of human rights. In fact, quite the contrary. You're very much aware that Israel passed the Jewish nation law, which was very disputed, very much disputed by some people on the left that felt that this was not respecting the human rights of the Palestinians in Israel, that is, of Israeli Arabs. And more tangibly, you know that Arabic was an official language of Israel, and recently Netanyahu and his cohort got rid of that. So as you see, the right, which used to respect human rights, has moved to very opposite position. In fact, part of the endeavors of the right in recent years, until they lost this until there's a new government has been formed, has been to change the composition of the Supreme Court of Israel, because the feeling was very strong that the Supreme Court is doing too much to uphold human rights. And essentially the right wanted Parliament to decide what rights will prevail in a country and not a court. Now on the left, so there's been a tremendous shift on the right and the definition of the right over the years, from the inclusion of human rights, valuing greatly, to at this point really not caring for it very, very much because it gets in the way. Nationalism is very predominant now, but there's been a change on the left as well, which I found very interesting. The left, as we all know, started off being very socialist. The kibbutz movement was one of the examples of the socialism of the left. The left at that time was very concerned with equality and peace amongst workers, at building a true socialist society. And at that time, I guess I always knew this latently, but I didn't realize till I read it in the book. At that time, the left actually rejected the possibility of peace with the Palestinians. And it was latently in my mind that this was the case because when I read this, I remembered how Golda Meir used to refer to the Palestinians. She referred to them as the so-called Palestinians with great sarcasm, right? Like the left actually was quite certain that peace with the Palestinians would be impossible, which is the position of the right now. So there's been a tremendous change there. But then after the failure of Barak's efforts to strike a peace deal with Arafat in the year 2000 and 2001, and in fact, Arafat launching the Second Intifada in a very deliberate way, presumably, after Barak's tremendous attempt to strike a peace deal with him, the left has become very disillusioned about the possibility of real peace. But there was another change in the ideology of the left. At this time, the left became very, very concerned with human rights, which was not a great concern for Golda Meir, at least not when it came to Arabs. And now the left has become very concerned with the human rights of Palestinians, and they've become very caught up with the evils of the occupation. Okay, so these are interesting metamorphoses over time in what left and right meant in Israel. But right now it's very simple to characterize what's left and what's right in Israel. Okay, the next topic is the political arguments that are used by the Israeli right to advance its ideology. First of all, there's a security argument, which is very obvious. The right harps on the fact that 70% of Israel's population and 80% of its industrial capacity is in the very narrow coastal plain around Tel Aviv. And how dangerous that is, and how very dangerous it would be if foreign powers or hostile powers occupied the heights over the Jordan Valley, occupied the hills of Samaria and Judea. So, and another thing is that being in the heights in Judea and Samaria, in addition to protecting that area from being taken over by hostile force that would threaten the coastal plain and the heart of Israel, in addition to that, having troops positioned in the Jordan Valley, it would, of course, prevent influx of arms coming into the Palestinians. And it would also prevent the hordes of refugees which have been created in Iraq and Syria and elsewhere from flooding into a Palestinian state. So the right is totally convinced that for security reasons, Israel has to be extremely cautious about any kind of withdrawal from the West Bank. In fact, the religious right, of course, is also concerned that it would be other kind of violation if they got out of there. Is there a counter argument to this from the left, which one should take up now? There is. The left points out, as Barak does so very well, that Israel is a military, economic, and, well, industrial colossus in the Mideast. I mean, Israel is a significant military power, a significant economic power. And Israel, together with an internationally recognized peace treaty, et cetera, would be more than strong enough to take care of itself so territory could be evacuated. Nonetheless, from the point of view of the right, the security argument is paramount. But the right has other kinds of arguments as well. First of all, the right is very adamant, and Goodman endorses this completely, by the way. The right is adamant that the Palestinians, the predominant emotion they experience in relation to Israelis is humiliation. the humiliation that arose, well, as a result of the loss of the 1948 war and the loss of all of that territory, which is of course compounded in 1967. Secondly, in order to satisfy the Palestinians, one would have to restore an awful lot of what was taken to try to lift their humiliation. And Goodman thinks this is not going to happen.
Right.
And then again, what's that? Oh, okay. Now, another element in why you're not going to move the Palestinians and the Israelis away from the positions they're in now is because, unlike the Palestinians that have the sense of humiliation and need to have that eased, the Israelis, according to Goodman, have a tremendous sense of fear in relation to the Palestinians. And this fear is evidenced, he says, that a lot of Israelis are very uncomfortable when they hear Arabic spoken within their vicinity. This is a claim he makes very, very clearly. Now, because of these conflicting emotions, humility versus tremendous fear, if Israel withdrew, this is the right argument, if Israel withdrew from the West Bank or substantial amounts of the West Bank, it's inevitable that terrorism from the Arabs, from the Palestinians would start up again. And given Israeli fears of Arabs, it's inevitable that Israel would respond to this terrorism in the way it's responded in the past very disproportionately. This has always been a matter of Israel's defense doctrine, that you have to hit back 10 times as hard, if not more, to establish deterrence. So essentially, the right is saying, given the mentality of the Israelis towards Palestinians and vice versa, there is no way these guys are going to let you evacuate and carry on peacefully. There's going to be far more conflict and bloodshed. Now, another argument of the right is that withdrawal is prohibited. This is true, of course, of the religious right. Withdrawal is prohibited by the Torah, because according to some interpreters of Torah, not all, okay? Many don't agree with this, but some very significant interpreters of Torah, including Nachmanides, and that's been widely accepted amongst the religious right, says that it is forbidden to surrender Jewish land to foreigners of any kind, Palestinians or other kinds of foreigners. As well, it's forbidden, obviously, to put Jewish lives at risk. And the right maintains that in pulling out from the territories, you're putting lives at risk, and also you're violating a Torah prohibition. Of course, there's an argument against this, a counter argument. You can simply point out that if peace would bring peace, if withdrawal would bring peace, then obviously it would be a mitzvah to withdraw, because that would secure lives far better. So they argue on this point. Another argument of the right is the nationalist argument. With the nationalist argument, it runs something like this. The West Bank is the heart of biblical Israel. Hebron, so on and so forth, is the heart of biblical Israel. And withdrawal from those areas for any reason would obviously diminish Jewish identity. It would take away a big part of the Jewish soul. And this is probably true of the right-wing religious Zionists, that's how they feel about that particular area. And by the way, even Barak says it would hurt him to leave, but he's willing to be pragmatic about it. Now, let's go to the political arguments used by the left. First of all, the left also has a security argument. The left points out the dangers of having a majority Palestinians between the sea and the Jordan, between the Mediterranean and the Jordan. As I mentioned before, Israel would be an apartheid state if it was to retain control of this entire population. If it gave up control, then obviously Jews would cease to be a majority in the land of Israel. So this is a terrible, terrible security danger. You'll hear more on it later from Barak. Then, very, very strong. Sorry, I misstated the security argument of the left, forgive me. It's a lot simpler than I try to make out. It's very simple. According to Goodman, this is Goodman's view, that peace treaties, international guarantees would be sufficient to replace the security that's being offered right now by the West territory of the West Bank. That's the left argument, plain and simple. According to Goodman, Barak, as you're going to see, takes issue with this, and we'll see that later on. The demographic problem I already spoke about, the dangers of it. And according to a person such as Barak, it's imminent. It's happening right now, and we have to act quickly. Then another strong argument the left have is the moral argument. With respect to the moral argument, it goes something like this. Since 1967, Israel has been robbing the freedom of another people. Plain and simple. Israel has been marching against the direction of history by colonizing another people. And then Goodman goes on to say, and I think he means this, every Israeli has an equal share in the military rule of another people. That's quite a charge that Goodman is making. He's certainly not a rightist in that respect. And finally, continued occupation, this is a moral argument and religious argument, continued occupation violates the biblical prohibition of not to oppress the stranger, because as the Bible says, you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You know what it's like to be a stranger, and you must love the stranger, you must not oppress the stranger. So those are the arguments of the left. There's one counter argument of the right that's worth mentioning here. The left, of course, is arguing that the West Bank is occupied territory. Some in the right would even say the land is not occupied. And the argument runs as follows. The West Bank was taken in a defensive war, not an offensive war, not an aggressive war. It's a war of defense that was initiated by others. At the time it was taken, it belonged to Jordan. Do you really want Israel to return it to Jordan, a hostile power which attacked it? That seemed to be a little inconceivable. And then the point is made, there never really was, technically this is a correct point, there never really was a Palestinian state. Hence, the West Bank is not occupied territory, not occupied Palestinian territory. But Goodman brings up a very good counter argument to this. He says, okay, I can accept that perhaps the territory, the West Bank territory itself, is not technically occupied because there never was a Palestinian state, but it's obvious that the Palestinian people are occupied. And that in itself is terrible, as he's already spelled out, and something has to be done about it. And of course, what he's advocating is moving into these partial peace plans and divergence plans. More on that later. The question now is, how should one deal with Catch 67? The fact that both sides are right. The right is correct that withdrawal is dangerous to the security of Israel. And the left is correct that not withdrawing is dangerous because you're going to have a Palestinian majority. And then Israel's really in big trouble. What Goodman advocates is the following. First of all, he advocates a partial settlement approach. And I'm going to go through some of the details of that. The partial settlement approach is an old idea. It was originally propounded by Yigal Allon, who was defense minister at the time of the 1967 war. What Alon advocated was essentially retaining the Jordan Valley and the heights of Samaria and Judea, and arguing that that would be sufficient to protect the security of Israel. The rest of it you can give back, except possibly some areas that are necessary for security. Remember, at the time, there weren't the large settlement blocks on the border of Israel on the Green Line, nor was there a dispersion of so many small settlements, many of them illegal, throughout the West Bank. So Alon could have advocated that. Nowadays, this particular plan originally concocted by Alon, you'd have to restate it as follows, and this is what Goodman says, that Israel retaining the Jordan Valley and the heights could do something to minimize the occupation, to lessen the occupation, to lessen the friction of the occupation, and enhance the sense of autonomy of the Palestinians. And we try to keep up this stance until the Palestinians maybe are going to be more inclined to swallow some of their losses and sign a peace agreement with Israel. But in the interim, it's very important to minimize friction, to maintain distance, and this is what these two plans would do. Now, it's very interesting that when the Alon plan was first presented in 1967, Israelis seemed inclined to accept it. It made sense to them at the time, and it's understandable, possibly because there weren't all the settlements to protect. But now times are different. And secondly, although the Israelis were inclined to accept it, the Arab nations and the Palestinians were adamantly opposed to accepting it. In fact, a somewhat recent poll in the West Bank showed that a majority of Palestinians feel that a settlement with the Israeli, I think there was something, a poll that was done in 2016, that a majority of Palestinians feel strongly that a settlement with Israel would require that Israeli troops not remain on any Palestinian territory. So you've got a real big problem over there. Now, here are the two plans. First of all, the partial withdrawal plan, the partial settlement approach, rather. Here's what would be involved. The Palestinians, you don't need their consent. They wouldn't have to relinquish the return of refugees. They wouldn't have to recognize Israeli sovereignty over their soil. It would be de facto, but they wouldn't have to accept that. They wouldn't have to recognize an end to the conflict with the Israelis, nor, and Goodman suggests that Palestinians are capable, because Islam allows it, of accepting a very long-term truce. And one of these two plans might be what underpins one of these long-term truces. Gila, I rely on you here. In Arabic, it's called what, a hudna or something? Something like that? Yeah.
Hudna.
Hudna. Okay.
That's at least what I know, yeah.
Okay, even Gaza proposes one of these long-term truces to the Israelis. So this is permissible within Islamic law. Therefore, Goodman thinks this plan might work. However, Goodman acknowledges that the Palestinian intellectuals that he spoke to about his two plans were very skeptical that the Palestinian people would accept it. But Goodman adds that with recent developments, where increasing numbers of Arab states, Sunni states in the Gulf, have actually had developed relationships with Israel, that there may be more pressure on the Palestinians to change their ideas of what they will and won't accept. That's his hope. And he puts this very well. If you applied one of these two plans or some combinations of them, that it would really transform the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians to a conflict between a state and its subjects, Israel and its subjects, the Palestinians, into one of a conflict between a state and its neighbors. In any event, Goodman insists that by minimizing the occupation in the ways he's describing, and still maintaining security, which would happen with either of these two plans, it would meet the objectives of both the left and right, and therefore enable the healing of divisions and acrimony between the left and the right. Now let's look at each of these two plans. The divergence of, oh, I didn't give you details of this, sorry. No, I did give you enough detail about the partial settlement approach. Essentially, it's withdrawal, except the Jordan Valley, and except for certain strategic areas, and except for the huge settlement blocks on the border of Israel. So that's what it would be. And you wouldn't have to ask Palestinian permission for that. Now let's look at the divergence plan. This was originally proposed by Kissinger in 2016. It was based on his assessment, that is on Kissinger's assessment. 10 minutes.
It's almost 8:30.
Yeah, I know.
Maybe leave Barak out of this.
Maybe you can leave me alone.
Yeah.
Okay. This was proposed by Kissinger in 2016 based on his assessment that an independent Palestinian state could not survive at this time given the turmoil in the Middle East. Take that for what it's worth. With this divergence plan, Israel would not have to evacuate a lot of territory. What they would do is enlarge the Palestinian Authority's powers, zones of control, and allow them a variety of national symbols so that they feel more autonomous. But it wouldn't require them to renounce any claims that they have or sign a peace treaty. So for example, recognize the Palestinian Authority as the state of Palestine. This is what Goodman is proposing. Let them have it. Let them have the recognition. Let the Palestinian Authority join the United Nations now, not as Israel has been insisting. First, the Palestinians have to recognize us and renounce all their claims before they can do that kind of thing. Let them do it now. It'll give them more of a sense of autonomy. It'll reduce friction. Transfer some Palestinian areas of Jerusalem to be designated as their capital. This is what Goodman is proposing. Then, to minimize contact between the Israeli military and the Palestinians, allow transportation contiguity, which they don't have now. It's very hard to go from a small Palestinian village sometimes to the Palestinians' fields, because that falls into a different area of the occupation where Israel has control. So what you have to do in order to make it more possible to have freer navigation is build tunnels, build overpasses, reduce checkpoints, and this would minimize friction. Then prevent expansion of settlements outside of the main settlement blocks. And then, this is quite radical possibly, permit the Palestinian residents of Area C of the occupation. Area C is the area that's totally under the control of Israel militarily and civilly. It's where most of the Israeli settlements are. It's where 60% of the Israeli land is in the West Bank. So Goodman is proposing allow the Palestinians living in Area C to acquire Israeli residency, not citizenship. The difference it would make to them is that they would have the same privileges that the Palestinian residents of East Jerusalem have, who are not citizens, but residents, and as a result of that, they have more freedom of movement, and they're entitled to national insurance and unemployment benefits. So this would clearly ease things as well. So these are his plans. The last thing I have left, and perhaps I'm going to stop and not even do that, I'm just going to summarize very briefly that Ehud Barak is quite critical of Goodman's ideas. Essentially, although he thinks it's a terribly well-written book, Barak says there's no Cat 67. There's really no equivalence between the security risk of not withdrawing, which Barak thinks is dire because having a majority of Palestinians is imminent. It's happening right now, and he says one has to act very quickly to do something about it. But he says, on the other hand, the security threat from withdrawals can be managed. It could be managed with technology, weapons acquisition, and operational conceptions. Barak is very upset about this notion of a catch, an equivalence between the two risks, because he thinks it fosters paralysis. And if Barak is right that the demographic threat is imminent, you have to add right now. And that's where I'm going to stop. Gila, you wanted to add something about being pragmatic.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. And I'm sure people have questions and thoughts, so I'll keep this very short. But I'm just going to add the last chapter of the book, which is chapter 12, and he calls it Political Pragmatism as a Bridge Between the Left and the Right. And I think what interested, and thank you for recommending the book to me, because what I think his aim in the book, and we talked a lot about his suggestions and his offers of what could be done, but I think what was really interesting for me in the book was him trying to create a bridge between the right and left within Israel. Like the catch 67 that he's talking about is also about the catch between the Israelis and the Palestinians, but he's also talking about the catch within the state of Israel and the big tearing up of relationship and the ability to talk within the state, within the people themselves, within Israel. And I think from what I've seen in the last few months, not just within Israel, but within the Jewish nation as a whole. So there's this kind of really big break. And so that's why I found his book interesting, to try and unpack a bit of where the catch sits and where the not listening happens. And I recommend the book to people, even if you don't agree with any of his solutions or with his, theories, but the ability to bring both sides within the society and try and understand both sides and try and bring the reasoning of both sides is something that I haven't seen in a long time in pieces of writing that talk about politics or talk about culture or talk about, anything social that's happening around us. It's usually very partisan, and suddenly there's a book that tries to bring both sides. So that was interesting in itself. So I'll just bring a few of the things he suggests here at the end of why this could be important. And he says that he hopes that, what he hopes to bring people to understand, that we might not be able to solve the conflict at this point, but to try and convert it from a fatal situation to a chronic one. So I thought that was an interesting way of at least seeing this point in time of moving not into some utopia, but trying to say, okay, we have a chronic situation, how do we deal with it? And what he said, what he talked about before about the fact that something about the screen suddenly changed. Something about this place of the way he defined it, about the Palestinians working from a place of feeling humiliated and the Israelis working from a place of feeling scared, was that by maybe creating a sort of, not peace agreement, but a sort of chronic state and not a fatal state, would allow people to stop and breathe for a moment. Because I think at this time, because we're working within, both on the left and on the right, we're working within a utopian framework. The right is sitting and trying to arrive at Mashiach, and the left is trying to arrive at some peace deal. And both sides are working from a utopian vision and not a vision of there is an actual situation now that we need to try and live within and live with each other within. And he's saying maybe if we manage to kind of take that apart and breathe for a moment, we might be able to start actually living with each other. So, okay, so I think what he tries to bring in the last chapter is this, is to move beyond ideologies and into trying to find a way of living outside of ideologies, outside of what ideally all of us might want, and into just seeing where we are and how everyone can actually live within it. Which is why I thought it was interesting that he started with Jabotinsky. And it was Jabotinsky, right, that said in the future Israeli government, you would always have to have a Jewish prime minister and a Palestinian vice prime minister. I don't remember the name in English, and vice versa. Like you will always have to have both nations leading together. And that was Jabotinsky writing that. I found that fascinating. I didn't know Jabotinsky talked in that way at all or thought in that way. But that's disappeared from our conversation. This kind of thinking has disappeared. And so in the end, he's trying to bring us back to what's the actual situation and how can we actually try and live within it. And especially how can Israelis come back to living with each other. So that was a very brief summing up because I know it's already 8:28 and I want other people, if maybe people want to ask some questions or have some thoughts, to let other people have a bit of time to talk. But thank you very much, Jack, for bringing all this information to us. And Vaksha, go and read this. Ken, thoughts, questions, ideas? Ken, Miriam.
I did not hear any mention of Hamas. How do they figure into this whole situation? It's one thing to try and find a way of negotiating some kind of, I won't say maybe peace, but arrangement of living side by side. But I don't think Hamas will be able to join that type of plan.
Yeah, it's not expected by either of these people. The only idea I recall seeing, either from Barak or from Goodman, is that it would be very important for the Palestinian Authority to essentially take over the government of Gaza. Without that, there would be a problem, no question about it.
Well, that was the original failed Camp David, was Arafat went back and, as a dictator, because he was a dictator of the Palestinian people, let's face it. I think in that case, the only way he could stay in power and get reelected was war.
Yeah, but
that's where he stood on.
Okay, just to answer your question more directly, I think from the point of view of somebody like Barak and even Goodman, you have to move on these plans like immediately. You can't wait for Hamas. You separate them, you insulate them, and you go ahead and you make changes on the West Bank because of the concern about the demographic problem.
But Jack, do you really feel that you can proceed without having some type of arrangement or understanding with Hamas? I don't think that's possible.
No, I'm just going to reiterate, it doesn't matter what I think. I agree with you. It's going to be a problem. But according to both of these people, Barak and Goodman, You have to move on some plan now. Barak wants something far more extensive than what Goodman is asking for. Barak says Israel has to just move, rely on its own IDF for providing security and get out of most of the West Bank they can get out of. Otherwise, they've got a huge problem in the near future.
Okay.
Yeah, Bluma. See, Bluma has a question.
Okay, I wrote my question in the chat. I'm just curious. I mean, there are lots of Palestinian scholars, and I'm wondering if any of them have entertained the ideas from Micah Goodman's book and what their reaction is. Have you run into that at all, Jack?
Yeah, I've seen some reference, essentially in the form of a complaint. And this comes from the right, of course. And they may be correct. I don't hear the left saying something different about the Palestinians, that the Palestinians have not really been engaging in making in discussing the kinds of compromises that Barak and Goodman are thinking about.
I think though Bluma's question was, have you seen Palestinian responses to Micah Goodman's book, if I understand the question correctly?
No, I haven't. No.
See, remember when Yossi Klein Halevi wrote the book, A Letter to My Palestinian Neighbors, and there was a Palestinian who wrote a response to that, which was very interesting and very important. And I was just wondering if there was the same thing with Micah Goodman's book. Any Palestinians have?
I think this book is more of an internal Israeli conversation. This book is, at least the way I read it, is more about Israelis trying to explain themselves to themselves and trying to understand how we arrived at this point in time in the way that we can't talk to each other at all. And I think that's the central, from the way I read it at least. But it's interesting to hear people who aren't Israeli talk about it. But it's more the Israelis trying to look at themselves and see what's happened to us over the last 70 years. And how come we arrived at this state where we are able to talk about so many other things, but about this, we're absolutely, like, it keeps exploding, verbally exploding. That's why I think maybe because it's not aimed at the Palestinians or at other people who are not Israeli in general. At least that's how I read it. But Jack, maybe you saw something else.
No, I think you're completely right. It's not written for Palestinians. And what Goodman is advancing doesn't require Palestinian cooperation. Ideally, you would get it, but it doesn't require it. Goodman says you have to initiate some elements of these plans, like toot sweet, you know? So it's not really written for Palestinians. For Palestinians, it would probably be a bitter pill.
Well, if it's, yeah.
And the only hope, I think, like a guy like Barak thinks that, how are you going to bring this about? He says pressure from Arab nations that increasingly are recognizing Israel. Pressure on the Palestinians. They may not like it. And of course, you know, another part of it, offer them megabucks. Dollars might soften them up a little bit too, but they don't like this.
Well,
They may have to be dragged into it by money and threats and God knows what.
See, Jerry has a question.
Yeah. Yes, I think Israelis are entitled to have some defensible state, and I think to get that, they might be well off to recognize a particular area in Palestine or the West Bank as a Palestinian state. I mean, in order to maintain a Jewish majority in Israel, it would be helpful to identify an area that could be seen as a legitimate Palestinian state. And I think it would help a lot to unsettle some of the settlements around Jerusalem. I think there's been quite an expansion of settlements there that, you know, we managed without before. And also, final point, I don't think arguments about the Mashiach coming are going to carry much weight in the overall discussion. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Well,
But that's what Micah Goodman is trying to illustrate to us. I mean, I might not believe in Mashiach coming, God forbid Mashiach arrives, but half of the nation, half of the people living in Israel and outside of Israel, okay, probably half of the Jewish nation believes in this idea of Mashiach. Now, what do? How do you talk to people who believe in the Mashiach? Like, what do you do with this? And how do you bring down, like, so that's why I'm saying this is an internal conversation of how do we bring down our own fears? How do we help people in Israel bring down their own fears? How do we go into a conversation with people who think the Mashiach is supposed to come? And if we're not actively doing something towards that, then we're impeding the arrival of the Mashiach. And then where's the conversation? How do we have a conversation? I think that's why the book is interesting, because you suddenly see the other side, not as the Palestinian other side, but the Jewish other side. Ken?
Yeah, but by the way, can I just add this from the book, that the idea that the 67 war inaugurated the beginning of the coming of the Mashiach, I think that idea is not as strong amongst the religious Zionists in the West Bank as it used to be. I think that idea was weakened an awful lot when Israel evacuated the settlements in Gaza.
Yeah.
Really, because, you know, the messianic thinking was, it's all coming together. We have settlements here, we have settlements there. And even the secular Jews are working towards the same end that we are. But then the evacuation of settlements in Gaza and even in northern Samaria, or evacuation of settlements, I think that exploded for the religious Zionists the idea that the Mashiach is coming. But they still want to be there because there's halacha that they mustn't abandon the land, give it up to non-Jews, you know.
And that's the point that he says in the book, that he kind of, like Robert, 1 second, I'll just finish this kind of Jack's thought here. I think that's the moment that he said that the right in Israel moved from a messianic point of view to focusing so much on security. I think that's where he says that they said, okay, this is how it is. And that's where part of this is what Meital is, I think, maybe also talking about, that there's this really big divide within Israeli society. And I think it's spilling over into Jewish society in general, into all of the Jewish people, this really strong divide. And it's with everyone, it's based on fear. Ken, Robert. Sure.
Yeah, but there's still the nationalistic sentiment that's extremely strong in the West Bank.
Yeah.
You remember Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Cook, the son
of Cook's son, yeah.
Rabbi Cook, yeah. He, before the 67 war, the man was bawling his head off. He said, "Where's my Hebron? You know, where's my Bet El?" Like, to him, this was sacred. So I think there still is that strong attachment to the West Bank, regardless
of the land of Israel.
It has something to do with the Mashiach coming or not.
Ken. Okay, Ken.
Even Barak says he feels that attachment, but he's willing to give it up.
And I think that's what the book's about. It's not about us and the Palestinians, it's about us and ourselves. That's the catch that he's talking about. Ken, Robert, Bukasham, and I saw that Meital also wrote something, but yeah.
Okay, so there's so many things in this book in terms that I disagree with. That,
you were frozen, but I couldn't hear you.
Okay, I was saying there's so many foundational assumptions and different historical narratives in this book that that I disagree with, that I really found it difficult to get into his arguments. I found it interesting as a sort of diagnosis of left and right in Israel. I'll put all that aside, and I just have a sort of a factual question, because you, Jack, and Gila have both been talking about this left-right divide in Israel, but much of the stuff I've been reading, and it is, very much secondhand, but says that the Palestinian issue doesn't rank high for Israelis. It's not on their minds very much, or it hasn't been, at least until the recent Balagan a month or so ago. But up until that, Netanyahu had pretty much succeeded in keeping the Palestinian issue out of Israeli consciousness. It was a security problem to be dealt with by the army. We'll leave it to the professionals, let them worry about it. It's not something ordinary Israelis had to spend much time thinking about. And I'm sure there were some dedicated left-wing people that didn't fall into this, but they were a very small minority from the stuff that I've read. Is that completely untrue?
No, that's.
Gila?
I wouldn't see it that way. I think, first of all, the army isn't a professional army. All Israelis go, or at least apart from the Haredim, all Israelis go into the army. So it's everybody's business. Like when you're in the army, you deal with army issues. And most of us go into the army. So we all have to deal with army issues, and we have to deal with meeting the Palestinians or meeting the army. So it's not the professionals, it's everyone. But apart from that, I think, and that's why I think unless there's these outbursts of war, between the outbursts of war, I think people feel that they can't deal with this issue because they can't solve it. Like there's nothing we can solve. So I think most Israelis, and Meital, maybe you have a different understanding of this, but I think most Israelis, at least the people I speak to, and it doesn't matter if it's the cab driver or the person in the shuk or friends, everybody has an opinion about this. Everybody's emotionally involved, but most people say there's no solution. So if there's no solution, you can't deal with it. So you go and deal with things that you think you might be able to find a solution to. You don't deal with things that you can't solve. So I think that's where maybe there's an emotional barrier, but the definition of right and left in Israel sits on the question of our relationship with the Palestinians. Like that's where it sits. That's the dividing line. That's how people identify themselves on a political spectrum and on other spectrums as well. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's definitely on people's minds.
There's just one more thing I think that's worth putting in. Goodman makes the observation, and I think he's correct, that people vote in Israel. Their vote is very much determined by this issue. Mm-hmm. I mean, we've had until the 73 war and its aftermath, right? And then people, and the kerfuffle of the intifadas, I think that put the leftist ideas into bad repute, and people are happy as long as the rightists are there because they're going to take care of this problem properly. Anyway, that's what Goodman says. People vote on the basis of it.
You vote on the basis of this, and you can't ignore it because it's not like here. Like the border isn't far away. The border is next to your house. Like you can't ignore it. It's in your neighborhood. I see Judith has raised her hand. Judith? Shalom, Judith.
Shalom, can you hear me now?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. I would like to say that that just because people are not, it's a different side of the crystal, if you will, to what Gila was saying, which is saying just because people don't officially talk about something doesn't mean that it isn't an important factor in lots of other decisions they make, including political ones. You know, just because you don't hear people saying, yeah, talking about the Palestinians doesn't mean, even the reaction that Gila described of we can't do anything about it, there's no solution, doesn't mean it isn't weighing on people. That's all.
It's weighing on people, but as I mentioned to Gila before we started this whole Zoom, that when in my correspondence with some family and acquaintances in Israel, they're not talking about this. I want to talk about it, but they don't. They want to talk about COVID. They want to talk about the coalition and how shaky it is. They want to talk about Bibi. I'm sure it is somewhere in the back of their minds, but they're not, it's not uppermost in their everyday deliberations. At least that's my impression.
I think that for most Israelis, unless they're mamash kind of disconnected from, unless they're actively disconnecting, like, and you have to be actively disconnecting from the reality of the situation, people talk about it maybe less, and especially less with people from outside of Israel, because it's the basic structure of reality. You don't talk about the fact that the earth is flat every time you talk to someone. It's part of what makes reality reality, and it's part of the everyday. There's only so much that you can talk about something that you don't perceive yourself as being able to change. Now, I think on the radical, or not radical, but on the far right and far left, people think they can do something to change, and they're actively doing it. So they talk about it more, but the majority feel they're locked in something that there's no way they could change. And so how much can you talk about it?
And why talk about it when the right wing is predominant right now? It has been since the time of Begin and Shamir and so on and so forth. I mean, if all of a sudden Emeritus was going to get an awful lot of members of parliament, I think there'd be,
and then the Mashiach comes.
there'd be an awful fear in the country. See, the left wing has been put down. They've almost vanished. So
That's kind of what I was suggesting with my question. Is there still a left in Israel?
Oh, there is. There is.
well, Barak identifies himself as left. He thinks that Goodman has portrayed the left in a very caricature manner in the book, that all the left is concerned about is Palestinians' human rights and feelings for Palestinians. And Barak is sort of saying, no, this matter of getting out of the West Bank is a matter of security against being overwhelmed by an Arab majority. And so you got to do it on that basis.
Ken. Yeah.
Okay. So I guess one of the things that rubs me the wrong way is this strategy of trying to triangulate between the two sides and find a solution that lies between them. This was also underlying your last talk to us, Jack, where you were talking about the difficulty of left and right in North America talking to each other and the different value structures there. And I'm looking at the U.S. I'm from the U.S., so I'm speaking as somebody from there. We're looking at a Republican Party that's going all out fascist. And I don't see any value in trying to follow some sort of attempt at bipartisanship with those kinds of political actors. And that temperament or that reaction is sort of transferring to my assessment of this debate within Israel. I don't know how productive it is to try to triangulate between left and right in Israel, and I'm really frustrated by the lack of interest in talking to Palestinians that Goodman is showing here. So
That was my idea.
Well, he says he's talked to Palestinian intellectuals who told him that they don't think that his two plans would be endorsed with enthusiasm by the Palestinians.
who knew? So can I just say one more thing? And this has to do with how Palestinian rejectionism is portrayed. The two-state solution is already, in the Palestinian view, is already a huge compromise. It's already swallowing a terrible, bitter pill. Giving up all of that, 70-some% of the territory, settling for 20-some% is already seen as a huge compromise. And the problem with a two-state solution is that Israelis are saying, okay, you're willing to make that compromise? Let's compromise on that compromise. Why can't you compromise on the compromise? I'm reminded of a poem written by a Canadian First Nations poet who talks about federal treaties saying, we guarantee you 5 million acres of land, and on these 450 million acres that you will have, you will be able to do whatever you want on these 300,000 acres, and it goes on and it keeps getting down to, to 50 acres, to 10 acres. I think to the Palestinians, this whittling away of the territorial claim means that they're not being dealt with in good faith.
Well, Robert, let me ask you something. What do you think of, Barak's idea, which I didn't spell out, it was in the notes, but I didn't go into it, where he's saying essentially you have to maintain troops in the Jordan Valley. You have to retain control over the heights. I don't know if he's saying a whole army, but he doesn't want civilians there, just a military presence. You have to retain the border, the large settlement blocks on the Green Line. There may be some other security areas. And of course, you have to protect and retain Jewish East Jerusalem. And the rest of it, you can let go. And we can take care of our security because the IDF is very strong.
Well, from my perspective, and I'm an outsider here, I don't live there, but from my perspective, any minimization of the occupation would be a step in the right direction. It would be very welcome to me.
No, but for Barak, this would be a final settlement. That's what he would want it to be, which presumably would come about as a result of exerting a lot of pressure on the Palestinians by other Arab nations and by pouring a lot of money in there.
Well, the throwing a lot of money at them was
final. I'm asking you, what do you think of Barak's idea of a final settlement? Palestinians have no reason to love it, but from a security point of view, to Barak, it makes sense. It's doable.
well, it's not up to me. But you're asking me what I think of it?
Yeah.
First of all, the throwing a lot of money was Jared Kushner's solution, and it didn't get very far. In terms of exerting pressure, I put a whole lot more hope in the international community exerting pressure on the state of Israel. If you want to talk about external pressure.
No, you've answered it very clearly. So you think that if the Palestinians lost the mountain ridges in Judea and Samaria, because Israel needs them for security, and if they lost Jewish East Jerusalem, and if they lost the border settlement blocks, and they had all the rest, that wouldn't be enough for them.
Well, look, I should not be speaking for the Palestinians. If I took any steps in that direction, I retract and recant. I am not able to speak for the Palestinians.
Speak for yourself.
I think I can understand the Palestinian objection that what they're being offered is it's already in their minds a huge compromise, and at the end of the day, they were willing to settle for that if they got a real state. But what's being offered is not going to be a real autonomous state. It's going to continue to be under the military control of the IDF, and I could understand that doesn't feel like autonomy.
Well, the IDF will not be in the regions that they're going to have for their state unless the Palestinians create some emergency which requires the IDF to go there for reasons of self-defense. But otherwise, they will not see the soldiers. In those areas, there will not be checkpoints.
I had a question to ask. I asked it once. I asked an Israeli consul official, and the person laughed at me. Is it possible to build into the sea like what Dubai and United Arab Emirates is doing, and then move some of these settlements into these acquired land on the sea? Because these settlements are basically on the front line. If another war starts, they're on the front lines. So is it possible to build in the sea like how United Arab Emirates is doing, build in the sea around Israel?
I'm not sure I understand what you mean by building in the sea. Maybe
Or
other people.
creating artificial islands, I think, and creating artificial land.
Yeah, like what United Arab Emirates is doing.
Yeah, I think that might have to be done, but it's not going to answer what people in the settlements are trying to do, which is live in Yehuda and Shomron. And they want to specifically live on that specific land. So it won't answer at least some of the settlers' needs, the way they see it. So it's already 9 o'clock, and I think so it's been an hour and a half. So I think we will leave it here. But Jack, thank you very much for preparing and organizing this and bringing all of this information and to people who are here and listened. And I think if people have more questions, they can probably email Jack to get more answers or go into the book and see what has been written. Do you have any last thoughts you want to share with us?
Just that I was convinced. Well, first, when I read Micah's book, I found it very convincing. Then I read recently Barak's critique of Micah's book, and I found that more convincing. So I thought I was very clear about what I thought should be happening, and then I read Barak, and now I'm clear again, but it's something different.
So people just need to read the Barak's critique.
I think it's worth reading Barak's critique. It's also worth reading that fourth item that I listed, or was it a third? Advancing the dialogue of security system for a two-state solution. One of the people involved in developing it was Major General Gadi Shamni, an Israeli, obviously, with a lot of experience in the territories. And you'll see there are very serious plans of how to maintain security, even if Israel had to evacuate good chunks of the West Bank.
Okay, בסדר. So thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining. And so have a good week. Drink a lot. Wear a hat.
Shavua tov.
Shavua tov.
Shavua
Shavua
tov.
tov. Bye.
Shavua
Thank you,
tov.
Prof. Thank you.
להתראות. Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Shavua tov, Shavua tov, Shavua tov.
Bye. תודה רבה.
Bye.
And
Yeah.
good luck with the Messiah.
אוי, כן, ממש ככה. ביי.